We all need to get better at understanding disabilities, whether it be mental, emotional, or physical. Those who experience disabilities are important and valuable, and we need to get better at understanding them and including them. For this episode of Theology Breakdown, we do a deep dive into understanding disabilities as it pertains to the Bible, theology, and the church. For this episode, I actually have this special guest, Dr. Lamar Hardwick, who wrote The Disability and the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion, to share with us to really help us understand this subject better. He's actually known as the Autism Pastor. Stay tuned for this episode. My name is Josh Samuel, and I'm the host of Theology Breakdown, where we really seek to break down the transforming themes of theology in an accessible format. Stay tuned to hear this episode. Today, I'm super excited to have Dr. Lamar Hardwick, who is the author of Disability and the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion. He does a lot of stuff. He's also a pastor and a Tri-Cities church. And in the States, what city is that in again?
The church is in East Point, which is just south of Atlanta.
Okay.
So on the south side of Atlanta, right next to the airport.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lamar, for joining me here. Your book really covers super important themes that as Christians and even people who may not be Christian really need to reckon with. So thank you so much for joining with me today.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor.
Yeah. First off, Lamar, tell me a bit about your why. Tell me a little bit of the why on why you wrote on the subject of disability and the church. And I know it relates to your personal story, so maybe you can kind of share a little bit briefly, especially for those who may not know you that well.
Sure. So for those who may not know me or heard of my work, I'm primarily known online as the Autism Pastor. Mm-hmm. So if you go to any of my handles, my Twitter handle, or even my website is autismpastor.com. And that's because the short end of the story is age 36, back in 2014, after years of just struggling with a lot of things that I had no language for, no label for, I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I was, again, 36 years old at the time. But I share with people that right around the age of 7 or 8, I started to realize there were some significant differences between me and my peers. I just didn't understand a lot of things growing up. I pretended to understand things. Okay. I just copied what my fellow students were doing so that I could fit in. Mm-hmm. But eventually those coping mechanisms stopped working. And actually, I was diagnosed as a result of a transition to leadership in the church that I previously pastored for about 9 years. There's a transition between my predecessor and myself and me becoming the lead pastor of that church. And I really, really struggled. And I began to hear a lot of the things that I heard as a child, but it was coming in adult language. Things like he walked past me, didn't speak. He's not very social. His facial expressions and body language, he seems unapproachable. All things that I knew that I would never do intentionally. But for the first time in my life, I had to ask, why has everyone continued to say these things about me for my entire life? And I know I'm not intentionally trying to be rude or dismissive.
Yeah.
So after about a year of doing my own research, after having someone do an assessment of me that was for my doctoral classes at the time. Oh. And it was a guy I really respected, and he wrote as an assessment of me that I have a hard time picking up on social cues. I get laser focused on one task at a time. And his assessment of me that was intended as a class assignment actually read like diagnostic criteria for autism. So I started to research the terms that he used because I had never heard of social cues before in my life. And that led me down the trail of discovering that there's this whole world that had a language to describe how I experienced the world that I didn't understand. So after about a year of doing my own research, I got the courage to ask my wife to help me to find someone to assess me. And by that time, I was pretty sure that I knew what was going on.
Wow.
And I eventually found someone, and they diagnosed me on the autism spectrum at age 36. So my writing the book has come from a place of a personal journey,
Hmm.
of understanding some of the struggles I've had in life and with the church, in a lot of ways that I was able to identify some of the barriers that even challenged me as I was pursuing my call to ministry.
Hmm.
So after I had gotten the diagnosis, it gave me the language to explain things in a way that was meaningful and helpful, particularly for those in the church. And so I decided to write the book as a way to try to help further the conversation about perhaps some of the ways that the church has unintentionally created barriers for persons with disabilities.
Hmm. Wow, that's huge.
Mm.
Like in your 30s to find out something like that. Like, how did you feel? Like, what was it stressful? Did you have a relief? Like, what was your kind of emotional response, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, good question. So initially I felt relieved.
Okay.
Um, and I share with people that for the first time in my life at age 36, I felt human,
Hmm.
because over the course of my life, I had been assigned labels based on my behavior and my characteristics and my personality that didn't fit
Wow.
social norms. And so things like lazy, inept, aloof, rude,
Wow.
all things that people were receiving from me based on my body language and my ability to read their body language and social cues, which, if you know anything about autism, that's one of the characteristics is it's a social communication, classified as a disorder, although I tend to not always necessarily agree with the term disorder.
Mm-hmm.
However, for the purposes of defining autism, that's one of the biggest characteristics. So that basically means that around the age of 12 to 18 months, most people start to develop an understanding of nonverbal communication,
Mm-hmm.
things that you do with your body, facial expressions, voice intonation. So if it's true, and I don't think it's quite as high of a percentage as we said it, but in the past, most of us have heard that 90% of all communication is nonverbal.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so you imagine if someone like me, your brain doesn't translate nonverbal communication. You
Yeah,
can
that's
imagine
wild.
how difficult it is. So I felt human for the first time when I got
Hmm.
diagnosed. I no longer saw myself as weird or weak,
Wow. Wow.
um, but just human.
Wow.
But then there was also a stage where I had a little bit of grief.
Sure.
So I actually stayed with the therapist that diagnosed me for about 2 years. My wife and I stayed with her just to unravel
Hmm.
my complicated history.
Hmm.
But there's a still sense of guilt because I replayed all the relationships in my life that never
Oh,
worked out, that I didn't
right.
know the reason why I was no longer friends with that person.
Hmm.
Um, but ultimately, it was able to swing back to a healthy perspective of it, and to be able to feel empowered that I now had the language to explain
Hmm.
myself
Hmm.
and explain to people this is how my mind works.
Yeah. Wow. That's powerful. You felt more human when you got
Mm-hmm.
the maybe right label, more
Right.
accurate. And let's be honest, like there's some people in the church who want to avoid a lot of this stuff. They're like, oh, there's nothing's wrong, But you
Mm-hmm.
kind of said like, hey, that like not having the appropriate label kind of messed with your own, understanding of yourself and just how it played out in your day-to-day life. So wow, this is huge, right? Because a lot of people want to avoid discussions about this and they want to avoid it in the church sometimes. And so this is powerful. I appreciate this. Let me ask you this, were there any myths about disabilities and how it relates to the Bible and the church that you were trying to dispel through your book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, there's plenty. I think
Okay.
probably the most common one that I see, but most people don't readily associate it with a myth, is that disability equals incompetence.
Okay.
That somehow, if you are born with or enter into a part of your life where you become disabled through an accident or something like that, that automatically equals that you're not competent. And so
Hmm.
what I share with people is always assume competence. persons with disabilities, whether it's intellectual, developmental, like myself, or even a physical disability, don't assume what they are unable to do. Always assume competence, and then discover what are some possible limitations that they do have in a very real and material way, and then make accommodations for that. But I think what we find in society and even in the church is that we automatically assume that this person with a disability is unable to do something. So we sort of work off of a deficit model versus discovering what their particular limitation might be, and then building some accommodations around that.
That's good. So assume competence. I like that. I like that. That's really good. Well, hey, related to question 2, I was just curious, like some people would say that maybe the Bible actually contributes to a faulty understanding of disabilities, right? You think about the passage in Leviticus chapter 21, where, it talks about, certain priests you can't be a priest if you have a certain defect. Someone might say a disability, right? If they're blind or lame. And then, people look, then that's the Old Testament. People look at the New Testament and say, well, hey, Jesus was, healing everyone. And so it almost gives the sense that those who may have a disability, and I don't believe this, but some people may say, oh, is the Bible saying that people who have disabilities are not normal and we need to cure it, or something's wrong here? And so people will say, hey, the Bible contributes to a faulty understanding of disability. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's another good question. So I think the first thing I would say is that, and we Christians are not necessarily always good at this. But first, we got to understand we're cooking in someone else's kitchen. So we've got to understand what the audience that it was originally written to would have understood about what was being said. So like, for instance, Leviticus 21, which does talk about some prohibitions. But I think there's 2 primary things to understand about that. One is that I'm not certain, and even in my studies and studying Jewish law, I'm not certain that those things were meant to be intellectually understood. It was appealing because it falls in a larger context of ceremonial or purity law. So those things were not necessarily meant to be understood, according to Jewish scholars that I've read, not necessarily understood to be intellectual. So therefore, trying to intellectualize or reason with what seems to be prohibitions is not the actual correct way of trying. It's not the proper methodology to try to wrestle with those passages, because it's not meant to be understood intellectually. The second thing is that so in saying that, it appeals to something spiritual. So using that as a framework. So
it's more, are you saying it's more allegorical, maybe like something symbolic?
Symbolic, allegorical. Okay. It is supposed to appeal to a higher spiritual sense of the soul. And when you put that within the framework of it being about purity or ceremonial laws, then it's about the actual ability to participate in certain Jewish practices or certain priestly practices, and it removes the physical part of it, to suggest that if there are some physical limitations that a practicing Jew would have, then they should not feel a sense of guilt about not being able to participate in those, in the rituals, and even in the priesthood, there's a certain ritual. So I think the best way to kind of describe that is like when you apply for a job and it says, you must be able to lift 50 pounds.
Right.
Okay. So if you're not able to do that,
right,
then we want to create an opportunity for you to understand the larger principle behind why that may be important. And then also relieve any guilt that you may have if you're physically unable to perform that part of the task.
Okay.
So if you're following me, the whole point is that it's not meant to be understood intellectually. It's not meant to be understood basically about the physical component.
Okay. So it's more would you say physical disability, not intellectual disability? Is that kind of you're distinguishing here between like
Uh,
they physically could not be capable of doing certain practices as a priest, so that was why?
If they're
That be right?
physically, or if there were, according to Jewish law, even if there were some mental limitations or
Mm-hmm.
something that would be um, something that may physically or mentally prohibit them from being able to practice it the way that they desired.
Okay.
I think that's the
Okay.
best way to. The
That's fair.
second thing, and I
Yeah.
think the thing about it also that's important is, as you look at those passages and you read around them and you understand the full breadth of it in the context of ceremonial and purity law,
Mm-hmm.
you also see that the only other class of people that were allowed to actually eat the food that was offered to God as a sacrifice were the disability community.
Hmm.
So you only had priests who were allowed and their families who were allowed to eat that food, and people from the disability community, which
Interesting.
spiritually
Hmm.
puts them in the same class as the priests,
Oh.
which suggests that it was never about their spiritual inability or about their lack of spirituality. It
Hmm.
was about the fact that there were perhaps physical or mental limitations that prohibited them from being able to practice some of the things and duties that were required of priests.
Wow.
And so what it did is it made a focus on them not having to live through the guilt of not being able to physically or mentally be able to participate in some of the practice required by priests. But it also pushed society now to be responsible for helping them to
Hmm.
practice to the fullest extent of their Jewishness, the ability to practice and participate in all things that made them good, God-fearing, and following Hebrews. So it's very complicated.
Sure.
But once you understand that it was never designed to point out their physical flaws, but
Mm-hmm.
to acknowledge that there may be some physical limitations and to relieve them of the guilt of not being able to fully
Okay.
perform the duties because of those physical
Okay.
limitations.
Okay. That's fair.
Yeah.
So that's pretty interesting. So you said the priests and the disability community could partake in the offerings.
Right.
You wouldn't happen to know the reference, would you? Or if you don't know it offhand, that's okay. I could maybe put it in the description or something like that below.
It's within that same um Levitical passage in 21. So I would read, starting around 20, 21, 22.
Mm-hmm.
But it talks about that. And then also I got that information from studying just Jewish law and
Cool.
understanding that, no one was allowed to eat the food that
Mm-hmm.
was offered to God except the priests and people who were disabled.
That's awesome. That's really helpful. And no, thank you for sharing that.
Mm.
All right, what about the gospels? People, love Jesus and they will look at Jesus and say, hey, like, Jesus was constantly healing people. Um, shouldn't that be our focus when it comes to disabilities? And because, people it is really the New Testament also contributing to a faulty view of those who experience disabilities.
Mm. Yeah, you would think that one of the things I share in the book is, and this is probably another myth, that Jesus did not heal everyone. If you read the Gospels and you put those in order, and you see particular passages where he went away from a city and didn't heal, or he stopped performing miracles. So he didn't heal everyone, but also when you study the Gospels, you start to understand that most of Jesus's miracles, including divine healings, were done in the early stages of his ministry as a way to sort of establish his divinity,
Mm-hmm.
to prove that. And in most cases, if not all, the primary goal was to restore those persons back into community.
Hmm.
So I think it was a bigger lesson than just healing their physical body. It was trying to restore a sense of dignity and help those who had pushed them to the margins to understand that this community very much belongs as a part of the larger community.
Hmm.
And he used healing as a vehicle to do that. So the end in and of itself wasn't to fix people. It was to frame a different way of society accepting those who were on the margins, particularly those who were in the disability community. So it's sort of a reframing. I think there's a line in
Hmm.
my book where I say, Jesus didn't just come to bring healing to earth, he came to bring heaven to earth.
Hmm. That's awesome. I appreciate that. It's really thoughtful. Um, That's really helpful. I really appreciate your straightforward comments on how the church can sometimes neglect those with special needs. And I like the theme that you use of invitation to the table
Mhm.
for fellowship, for a meal. And you make the connection with Jesus' invitation to invite those who can't even return the favor. Can you unpack that theme as it relates to kind of an important theological foundation for ministry with those with disabilities? And maybe I think maybe it connects to the theme of hospitality as well.
Mhm.
Can you share a little bit about that and how you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, so that comes from a section where sort of wrestling through the passage in Luke 14
Hmm.
of the banquet. And so, most of us, I'm assuming most of your readers have heard that story and read it.
Yeah.
But essentially, Luke records Jesus going to a dinner party that he's invited to by the Pharisees. And at that dinner party, after healing a man with dropsy, which would be something probably around the area of congestive heart failure, it causes his limbs to swell.
Mm.
What's interesting is Jesus heals him and then dismisses him from the dinner party because he realizes that the Pharisees never really invited the man there to be included. They were exploiting him as a way of trying to expose Jesus,
Mm.
whether or not he was going to heal on the Sabbath.
Right. It's pretty interesting.
But then Jesus ends up telling a story at the dinner party about a dinner party, and he talks about even before that about how we should never, when we're invited to the table, assume that we should take the seats of honor.
Hmm.
And then he tells them, don't invite people who can repay you. And essentially, to your question, he goes on to say that you should invite the people on the margins, the lame, the blind, the crippled, the poor. And what he's doing is really getting at what I think is a core theological and even ecclesiology issue. Is the reality is that most of the reason why churches have such a struggle with disability ministry is the first thing that goes into their mind is how much is this going to cost?
Mm.
And there is,
Mm.
there are some things that you're going to have to incur costs for. But I think what Jesus does is he starts to really pull the thread in our theology about cost versus value. So how much value do we have for people, and how is that intrinsically tied to what we think the potential cost of hosting them will be, and the potential return on investment by inviting those who can repay you? So Jesus is very explicit: don't invite your mother, your brother, your sister, your
Mm.
friends, those who can repay you,
Mm.
because it sets a precedent that we begin to build our churches based on this faulty sense of cost and value. So
Hmm.
we will value the people who can help incur the costs of the table that we're setting.
Hmm.
And Jesus flips that on the head and says, no, you need to value the people who God values.
Hmm.
And in doing so and making them the priority, he even goes on to say, then God himself will repay you at the resurrection of the righteous, which sorts of points to the fact that God then becomes responsible for the reimbursement, right?
Mm.
When you
Mm.
value the people that he values and you place them first.
Wow.
But in a lot of ways in the church, we kind of flip that on the head, and we want the people in our churches who have the perceived value of being able to incur the cost of what we're trying to build.
Hmm. Wow, I love that. So it's kind of like, hey, if you look at those who are on the margins, maybe those who in the disability community, they may not be able to repay you. Maybe they might though.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you do that, God will be the one to repay you.
Right.
Whereas what we've kind of followed a model is that we're looking for repayment from the people that we're contributing to or investing in. So I really like that. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as you mentioned, you refer to yourself as the autism pastor, and let's be honest, there are some segments within the church, and you kind of refer to that in your book as well, that people may not like that language. Referring yourself to as the autism pastor, you need to be referred to as the healed pastor. Pastor, claim your healing. Um, how do you respond to that? Where people like, let's be honest, like some church people, in particular movements within the church would just feel uncomfortable with that label. How do you respond to those people?
Yeah, I think the first thing I should say is that term is not something that I necessarily came up with. It came
Hmm.
from In the early days of me blogging and writing about my experiences, I had so many families and individuals in the autism community that were reaching out to me, and one woman inboxed me. This was several years ago. I don't even know where she is today. Who said, "You are the pastor for the autism community," because many of us don't get to go to church. We're not welcome at church, and so I sort of became their pastor. I prayed for them. They sent me questions. Some of them I would FaceTime and Zoom with their families just to provide them spiritual care. So that term actually came from somebody else. I actually just changed all my handles on social media to Autism Pastor because it made it easier for people who needed my help to find me.
Sure. Okay.
To answer the question, I think one of the things that I share with people sort of jokingly, but also as a way to help us frame in healing is I would often tell people, Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, but he's still dead.
He still died eventually.
So I said that to say is that healing has never been a path to immortality and is never a gateway to some sort of idealistic perfection, right? We're all still humans. We all still will die. That's and right. We all still will live with some varying degree of limitations. So, I share that because a lot of the faith traditions that would say to me what you just said as a part of the question don't take time to really unravel the fact that it's not a pass from immortality to immortality, and it's not a pass to allow us to live some sort of perfected life. Right. So I believe that Jesus did heal people in the Bible, but I think we need to first deal with that. It's not a path to immortality, and it's not a path to perfection.
Yeah.
So with that being said, the second thing that I usually share with people is, if we understand that, then we also have to wrestle with the fact that the people that have a quote unquote problem with me having that label is they really only have a problem with that label, Josh, is because I put those two things together, autism pastor. Right. And I've had that conversation with people. I think the reason why you have a problem with that is because you think those two things don't go together. And so, again, that's part of one of the myths of presuming competence, right? Autism in and of itself, I think people see it, they acknowledge it for the most part. And there will be some people who will think that child or individual needs to be healed. But I noticed that there was actually an increased sense of resistance to that when I attached it to the label of pastor, which also speaks to this idea that there's a certain level of perfection. There's a certain level of competence that pastors are assumed to have that doesn't necessarily correlate with autism. So I think, one of the ways I address it in the book is I play off of the parable of the wheat and the tares, particularly because autism is a neurological disorder. And so I just give the analogy is that in the parable of the wheat and the tares, the wheat and the tares grow together, and it's beneath the surface that they're all tangled up. And so what I tell people is that's sort of like my neurology. Beneath the surface is a complicated system of gifts and struggles, and they're all kind of intertwined together. But in that parable, Jesus says that the master tells the people, don't tear up the wheat from the weeds just yet, because if you do, it's going to damage the harvest. So one of the ways that I deal with that is I let people know, one, I do believe Jesus can heal, but he didn't heal everyone.
Right.
But then let's consider, if in that parable, he says, if you tear up the wheat, you tear up the weeds from the wheat, it damages the harvest. What if there is a reason why Jesus does not separate the complicated parts of my neurology from the gifted parts of my neurology, because he understands in the long run it'll damage the harvest. And so I think if we consider healing in that context, that perhaps God has a bigger understanding and a broader perspective of what it means not to heal. And in some way, what if he's protecting the harvest that could come out of that life by not separating that person from their disability?
Wow.
Which is what we see even in John 9, when they ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents? And he says, neither. This was done so that the glory of God can be seen. So Jesus flips the question from why can't this man see to how can God be seen in his life? And I think that's a much healthier and a better way to try to understand healing or the lack thereof
Hmm.
is that perhaps God is protecting a harvest
Hmm.
that he intends to get out of that life, and separating that person from their disability would overly complicate the ability for God's glory to be seen in their life, but also in the people around that person.
Wow, that's powerful. And I think you've kind of made those connections between Paul and his thorn in the flesh, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he prayed for it to be removed, but God let him keep it with him because it's actually helpful for him, right? Kept him
Right.
humble,
Yeah.
and helped
Yeah.
his ministry. So
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, no, that's super helpful. Can I ask you this question then? Related to that is, some people may say, well, Pastor Hardwick or Pastor Lamar, how do I go? Like, should I not pray for those who have disabilities? Like, how do I move forward? Like, without, like, you kind of mentioned that, hey, maybe God is preserving something by not healing in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
So what should be the approach of the church when it comes to prayer? Like, should we just ask someone to, hey, would you like me to pray for you about this? Or I don't know, help us out here.
Yeah. I would say it's always most appropriate to understand how that person views themselves in light of their disability,
Mm-hmm.
in light of the potential struggles or perceived suffering that may come as a result of the disability. And it's almost like the point I made earlier about assuming competence, right?
Okay.
Assume
Right.
that that person has their own understanding of their disability, any pain or suffering that may come as a result of it, and also the ways in which they may feel that their disability profoundly shapes their personality, their perspective on life, even their theology, right? And so I think it's most appropriate to get to know the person, center the voice of the person or family that's impacted by disability, and then understand how, based on their leading and their coaching and their teaching, based on that, understand what's appropriate to their situation. So a good example of that is, and I tell people, autism is unique in that it's neurological. So for me, the very nature that my disability is based in neurologically, that actually forms my personality. And so it becomes very difficult for me to perceive myself and understand myself apart from the very thing that helps shape the personality that I have.
Yeah.
So personally, for someone to ask to pray for me to be healed would be a little bit jarring. And it's not to say I don't have struggles and things that come along with it, but it's very difficult for me to perceive of a Lamar absent of the thing that actually makes up who I am. And that's not the case for all disabilities. If it's a physical disability, then I think it may be appropriate based on whatever that person's understanding of how that disability shapes them as an individual, and it shapes their relationship with God and shapes their theology. I think it's appropriate to spend time and learn from them what is the appropriate way to pray for that person.
Yeah.
But for cases where I think we also have to understand where disability profoundly shapes the personality, the perspective, all the things that people seem to appreciate about me, the way I read scripture, the way I preach, are all profoundly shaped by my neurological makeup.
Yeah.
To remove that, there would be a completely different person. And I'm not sure I would know how to navigate this world in a body without the thing that has made me who I am, including the struggles. So center the voices of persons with disabilities, ask them, get to know what's important to them, know how their disability shapes their life. And it may not be appropriate to pray for their healing because they feel as though their disability profoundly shapes who they are, how they see the world, and even how they view and relate to God.
I really appreciate that perspective, just really getting to understand the person and not just go in and say, oh, I'm going to pray for you and, pray for your healing, it can,
right.
So, appreciate that. Let's be more understanding and learn and hear before we start speaking sometimes and praying. Let me, this show that I host is about theology breakdown. And so can you tell me, are there some key missing theological components in our lives and churches today that is maybe leading to an inappropriate view of disability and disability studies? Like, what are some missing aspects of theology would you say is missing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a few. I think the biggest one, and I get pushed back about this, but I write about it in the book, is for me, I think we have to take a look and understand, if we look at our churches, places that we consider sacred spaces, and then we look at how across the board, and this is a generalization, but it's pretty true. Across the board, there's an extreme lack of disabled bodies that frequent these places that we have constructed that we call sacred.
Okay.
So for me, I think it begs to ask the theological question: where do we get the idea that sacred spaces need be completely void of disabled bodies in order for them to maintain its sacredness? So what I do is I go back and talk about where did some of those ideas come from, because I think the ultimate ideal sacred space for us Christians is heaven.
Yeah.
And in some ways, theologically and even subconsciously, we try to recreate the ideal sacred space that we assume to be by recreating that in our sacred spaces here on earth, the places that we worship, the places that we pray. The problem is that if we have this subconscious and theological idea that our ideal sacred space, which is heaven, is completely devoid of disabled bodies, then it's no wonder why we have such a difficult time creating sacred spaces here that include disabled bodies. And so I think one of the things I talk about in the book, and I get a little pushback about that, is where do we get the idea that in order to, as either a requirement or a reward, we rid ourselves of any imperfections as we go into heaven, not just disability. Because when I look in Revelation, I see there are identifying markers of the bodies and the lived material experience of persons here on earth, because it talks about every creed, color, and tongue was around the throne. So there are very clear identifying markers that are carried over into the ideal sacred space. Like, you don't just suddenly become a different ethnicity. When you, right? And so if those identifying markers are also there, then to what extent, I ask the question, are disabilities, one, an identifying marker in who we are, and two, how have we created this idea in our head that either as a reward for living a good life and being a Christ follower, you get to rid yourself of that identifying marker, or as a requirement, you have to rid yourself of those identifying markers in order to remain in the sacred space called heaven for all eternity. So we kind of get this idea, I think, from some of the things that Paul says about new bodies in Corinthians, which in my studies, and I've talked to some other biblical scholars, I don't think he's necessarily talking about getting a new body. He uses a lot of Hellenistic terms of tents, and he plays with a lot of words and puts together imagery that has never been quite used in that way before. And so, for instance, when he's talking about new bodies and putting on new robes, he's actually probably referring to the super apostles that he was always in contention with, losing their baptismal robes or being stripped of that body. Again, robe being a Hellenistic term, because of their false teaching. So he wasn't necessarily talking about a new body. He was saying they've been teaching the false gospel and they're going to be stripped of that old body, that baptismal robe, because of the way that they were. And then there's several other places, but in the end, he doesn't necessarily seem to be talking about a new body. Even when he says we put on incorruptibility, it's more of an addition to our current bodies than a removal of the imperfections of our current bodies. I think the best example of that is Jesus and his resurrection, who comes back with the marks of his impairment, which if we study that medically, the things that were done to his body in a true Roman crucifixion would have been um, really disabling, as far as the tendons in his wrist being torn. Roman crucifixion, they would turn the legs sideways. So it's not always a depiction that we see in pictures. They would have turned the legs sideways and driven a spike somewhere around the Achilles tendon. And I talk about in the book, I've torn an Achilles tendon and I still don't walk the same way. And I had mine surgically repaired. So if those things are not healed, and we know that Jesus and his divinity has also a body that can do things that human bodies can't do, like he can walk through walls, but he chooses to return and uses those disabling marks as a point of identification with humanity. So my question is, and you see even over in Revelation, when it also talks about the lamb that was mortally wounded yet still standing, sort of an interplay off of the fact that he still has these disabling marks and impairments, yet he's still found to be the only one worthy to open the scroll. If you put all that together, then I really have real questions about how much of those things that we consider to be disabling, that profoundly shape who we are and in our relationship with God, are required to be removed in order to be in sacred space with God for eternity. And why is it that when we envision the ideal sacred space, which is heaven, we don't often envision disabled bodies inhabiting that space? Because for me, it has profound implications for how we create sacred space here on earth. If I don't envision disabled bodies in heaven, which is the ideal sacred space, it's going to be very difficult for me to recreate that and be inclusive of disabled bodies here. So there's a lot of things that I think that we have to, and I don't even really come to a conclusion in my book. I just challenge people to think about that. Because it has huge implications for how we treat people here on this side of heaven.
That's huge. I worked with, discussed this a little bit with Dr. Amos Young, who talks about disability studies as well. And, there may be some people who have some form of disability and are hoping to be, that it's removed by heaven time, when they get to, be with the Lord and in the new heaven and new earth. And, when I challenged Dr. Amos Young about it, he kind of mentioned, like, in his book, he talked about it, you may have the marks of it. They may be present, but maybe not completely felt to some degree, so really interesting. So, you're kind of opening the door. So at least people are open to understanding, hey, like heaven, or in this new heaven and new earth, maybe like this utopia that you think it's going to look like this and that, but they're unique markers, that we see in Revelation and even in Jesus's marked body. So really helpful. Let me ask you this. When we begin to change our perspective, what do you think the church would look like? Like, if you've kind of mentioned, hey, this is an important theological foundation that's missing. What do you think the church would look like? Like, what do you envision it looking like when these things are more in place?
Yeah, I think, and this is part of why the subtitle of the book is a vision for diversity and inclusion. Like, so I tell people it's very lofty. I know, like but it's a vision. I think Jesus invites us, right, to quote unquote live with our head in the clouds when he says, pray like this, your will be done on heaven and on earth as it is in heaven, right? And so this interplay between the question I often ask myself, if this were heaven, what would it look like? And how do I work my hardest to try to make sure that becomes a reality here? Because we're trying to synchronize the ideals of heaven. And so if you think about what we just talked about in the last question, I think the vision for me would be like full inclusivity. Like right now, a lot of, and there needs to necessarily be a focus intentionally on being more inclusive of those with disabilities or special needs, right? And so, but what you tend to have in churches is it still kind of creates this silo of ministry that is aimed at that particular group of people. And in the end, if we're not careful, it still creates a sense of otherness. It still creates this, what I call compartmentalization of the church, right? And so ideally, I think that if we begin to sort of wrestle through some of these bigger theological issues and we come to terms with some of the things that we may or may not believe about sacred space that has been untrue, then you start to see what I have studied and realized that happened in the earliest days of the church, where there was really no need for quote unquote disability ministry. It was just the church responding to the teachings of Jesus, where all the people were included. And even ideally, you would have persons with disabilities in leadership in the church who can continue to help shape the church. And so I often tell people that the difference between being invited and being included is that when we invite people with disabilities to be a part of the church, we commit to sharing space. When we include people with disabilities in the life of the church, we give them the authority to help shape space. And so we need, ideally, as a part of the vision, to sort of return to what I saw in the first, second, and probably even the third century of the church, where persons with disabilities help shape the church. Some of the early church fathers who shaped the theology that we have now of the Trinity, and some of our most closely held doctrines, were disabled people. Were, and I can't quite remember the name of one of the early church fathers, but he was blind. I think he was the church father that helped to shape the ideas that we have now about the Trinity. And so in the early church, there were leaders of the church that shaped the theology of the church, that helped shape the space and the culture of the church and the doctrine of the church that we still hold closely today, who they themselves had disabilities and weren't considered incompetent in their ability to help lead the church. So I think ideally my vision would be for persons like myself to be worked out of a job, to where disability inclusion becomes such a part of the DNA of the church that it's just simply the church. It's responding to the teachings of Jesus, and allowing persons with disabilities to not just share space with us, but to shape the space that we worship in.
It's really good. Yeah, and getting your book, I think, is part of those steps in all of us as leaders and Christians in general, and even people who aren't Christian, to really kind of grow in our understanding, to get better at doing this. And so this is why I really appreciate what you're talking about here. There's some people who may be experiencing personally, or maybe within their family, things related to disabilities in their own life right now. And what word of encouragement would you give someone who's wrestling with maybe some certain special needs in their family, in their own life, seeking the way forward? Any words of encouragement? Maybe they've kind of felt neglected. Maybe they felt like, they don't fit in. Like, how would you encourage them?
Yeah, I definitely get that, just experientially. And I share with people that for all of the perceived success I've had, it's been a long, hard road with trying to fit into the church. So one, I would say, like, I think it's okay to acknowledge that. I think it's okay to acknowledge the reality that the church has not always been the most hospitable that it should be to persons with disabilities and their families. And in acknowledging that, that's not to say that I love it. I consider myself an apologist for the local church.
Cool.
And I often say that persons with disabilities are not knocking on the doors of the church simply because they need it. And they're knocking on the doors of the church because they also love the church. They have a deep, profound love for the church. Cool. And they want to be able to. So I would encourage those persons to know that the church, as a Christian, as particularly if you're a Christian, is as much of your birthright as any other Christian. That you have a right, because of your commitment to being a follower of Christ, to be a part of a local body, and even the Big C church, because it's a part of your birthright. So I would share with them, don't give up. There are places that are every day getting better at understanding these issues, and to don't give up because you have a significant contribution to be able to help shape the future of the church, so that we don't continue to have these problems in future generations. And then the last thing I would say is, going back to Paul, when he talks about his thorn and his flesh, and we could spend another hour talking about what those things might be. We know that he had eyesight problems, because he references that in Galatians, where he says, some of you treated me so well that you would have given me your eyes if you could have. So we know at least that. But what he does say in Corinthians is that to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given this thorn in my flesh, which it seems to be something physical. And I often like to tell people, and this is sort of a mantra I live by, what I love is Paul never says that his disability is what causes him to become the worst version of himself. He actually says to keep me from becoming conceited, which is the disability actually, when leveraged and led by God, is actually the thing that stopped him from becoming the worst version of himself, which is being conceited, being a person who doesn't understand their need for God and for community. And so what I share with people, and this has been a mantra for me, is that my disability doesn't have the capability of causing me to become a worse version of myself. In fact, it can, when led by God and by the Holy Spirit, it can actually help me to become the best version of myself. So with struggles and all the negative things that come with it, I do think there's a potential there to know God in a unique way. And persons with disabilities live out one of Paul's strongest tenets of the Christian faith when he talks about this battle between flesh and spirit, right? He talks about that often. Who knows that better than persons with disabilities?
Wow.
Because it's not just theoretical. Like, I literally, because of sensory processing and a lot of other things that physically challenge my body because of autism, I have to allow my faith to lead a rebellion against my body, to do things in moments that my body is saying is not possible. And so while, there should be some yielding to understanding your physical limitations, persons with disabilities understand that more than just theory. We live that every day. Our faith leads a rebellion against our bodies, that dynamic between flesh and spirit. So it does not have to be something that causes you to become the worst version of yourself. It can actually cause you, when it's deeply submitted to God, to be the best version of yourself. And we can be leaders in teaching others what it really means to live out a life as we're in the contest between our faith and our bodies.
Yeah, that's wonderfully said. Wonderfully said. I really appreciate that. If there's one thing you would like Christians to stop doing right now, especially in light of your own understanding of disabilities, what would that be?
Wow, so much. What thing would I want them to stop doing right now?
Just one thing.
I think it probably goes back to the incompetence issue. Like, I see that so much. And sometimes it is completely subconscious and unintentional. Like, we'll assume that because someone's in a wheelchair, we'll speak louder to them as if they can't hear. And so I think we just have this natural inclination to assume that if somebody's different from us, whether it's skin color or level of ability, that they don't have something to offer. And so I would ask us to really wrestle with our concepts and our theology of the Imago Dei, the image of God. And why do we sometimes think that there are physical barriers, whether it's disability, whatever it is, that can actually distort from that? I think the image of God in us is powerful enough to not be distorted by any physical limitation. So therefore, we should treat people with the highest standard and assume that God's image has the ability to work its way through what we perceive to be a deficiency.
Very good. So number one, stop assuming incompetence and assume competence. Okay. All right. So that's what we need to stop. What about start? Let's go to the flip side. If there's one thing you'd like Christians to start doing right now, what would you say?
I would say let's go back to the parable of the banquet and start giving up the seats of honor. And giving them to the people that Jesus said that they belong to.
Wow.
And in that, I think we create more space for persons with disabilities to help lead us into the future. So I think I have a line in the book where at the end of the chapter, I say the seats of honor have been stolen and Jesus is demanding we give them back. So I say we start giving those seats back.
Whoa. I come from a Pentecostal background, so I felt that a little anointing there. And when you're sharing here, so I appreciate your thoughts here, Dr. Hardwick. Really helpful, super helpful for me and for so many others. Okay, so I got Dr. Hardwick's book here on Kindle, Disability and the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion. I'd really encourage you to pick it up on Kindle or paperback. Or Dr. Hardwick, what's the best way others can connect with you and purchase your books?
Yeah, the best way is to go to my website, which is autismpastor.com. From there, you can connect to all my social media. It has links to all my previous blogs and articles I've written for other organizations, but also there's a link there. If you click on books, that'll take you to where you can purchase the books. And it's available just about anywhere you can get a book.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, I'm going to put links in the description below, which includes all of Dr. Hardwick's social media handles and opportunities to purchase the book as well. Dr. Hardwick, if you don't mind, I know you're a pastor as well. Not only do you have your doctorate, but you got a pastor. Would you mind just praying for the audience, maybe those who maybe are experiencing issues related to disabilities, and maybe for those who maybe haven't felt it themselves, but maybe we need to be prodded to think more about it and reckon with it in our own lives in church?
Sure. That's right.
Thank you.
God, we are thankful for our time together. I thank you for my brother, Josh, and for his commitment to your word and to the community of faith. And so, God, I also pray for all those who are listening in the future, whoever comes across this session that we just conducted, that they would be encouraged, particularly those who are either themselves disabled or family members who are part of the disability community because they are connected to and love someone with a disability. I pray for their encouragement and for their strength, that you would encourage them to know that they are very much a part of your faith community and they have a birthright to your church. And so I pray that they would be encouraged. And then for those who want to continue down this path of being the spark and being those who will initiate making their church more inclusive, God, I pray that you give them wisdom, but also give them proximity and opportunities to be close to those who are impacted by disability so that they can hear about the lived experience and they can make those adjustments. Just as you became incarnate in the flesh, help us to become incarnational in how we live in and amongst this community so that we can serve them better. Overall, God, we thank you for your church. We thank you that, Jesus, when you said you would build your church, that you meant it and that you are still building it. And so there is still hope. And we pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Really appreciate that, Dr. Hardwick. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us and blessing us with so many insights. Really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. God bless.
Bless.
Hey, thanks for listening today. If you would like to purchase Dr. Hardwick's book, Disability and the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion, be sure to check out the links in the description below. And if you found some of the insights helpful from this episode, I encourage you to leave a comment. Why don't you go to the video of this episode on my YouTube channel, and love to hear from you there. And if you found this helpful, be sure to share it with family or friends via your favorite social media platform. And be sure to follow and subscribe to Theology Breakdown on your favorite social media platform. Thanks for allowing me to be a part of your journey here on Theology Breakdown. God bless and much love.